the camp there had a great big drill hole there, and they had a dance one night there, and we had to. The commanding officer of the camp was a little English. He was a colonel, but he was an Englishman. I don't know whether he had been in Canada before World War I or what came after, but anyway, I can't remember his name, but he was a little guy and real nearsighted, but he wouldn't wear glasses, and when he'd inspect you of a morning, if he'd go down and inspect you, he'd just almost crawl right up under your helmet with you, because he was shorter than about anybody else, and he'd crawl up under there. One night I had shaved the night before, and he crawled up, and I happened to be one of the ones that he inspected close, and he crawled up under my helmet and said, "Did you shave this morning, Private?" I said, "Yes, sir," which was an outright lie. I hadn't, but anyway, I know better to tell him I didn't. And he said, "Stand closer to the razor tomorrow." Well, that's all he said as far as that goes. And one night, or one day, it came an ice storm along. This was in probably November, 1st of December. It came freezing rain, and the parade ground there was paved, blacktopped, and the barracks houses was around the outside of it. And we'd march out there and for inspection, morning inspection, and just marching and arms drill and so forth. And we got out there, and everybody was falling, slipping around. Everybody got lined up, and the sergeants got their platoons lined up and handed them over to the sergeant major, and then the sergeant major handed them over to the company sergeant major, and the company sergeant major handed them over to the regimental sergeant major. And he was a big old tall, real severe, quiet old man, good old guy. And they got him ready and called out the order for the regimental sergeant major to come out. He started out across the parade ground just real stiff and straight and walking, and he started slipping, and I know he went 20 feet before he ever got down, because he just one leg would go and another leg would go and both of them fly. Finally he did get down, but there was not one snicker there. Nobody laughed at all. And they had a dance there one night, and the old English colonel, little short guy, had a big Saint Bernard dog, female, and she had 2 pups that was big as buggy horses as far as that goes. But anyway, our little guy, he was a bugler, and French and Indian. His name was Dufresne, Wallace Dufresne. His dad was a Frenchman, and his mother was an Indian. But he was a good little guy, and he and I buddied around a lot. And we got that big St. Bernard female over around the edge of the drill hall, it's just like a great, huge, big gymnasium or something, where they was having the dance. And we got the big old female to lay down and got the pups around there, and they were nursing these two pups. And the colonel, he come by with dancing with one of the chaperones for the girls that came for the dance. They brought 3 or 4 busloads of them. And he was standing up close to her, looking up. She was about 1.5 feet taller than him. And I suppose he was feeding her a big line of some kind. And anyway, he stepped on one of those pups and it let out a yelp, and the female just reached up and grabbed him by the leg. Didn't hurt him or anything, but she got him by the leg. Dufresne and I was hard to find. Figured somebody'd tell on us, but we took off. But nothing ever come of it. And they, one time while we were still there, the Canadian paratrooper representative, I think he was a captain, I'm not sure now, came there and gave us a talk about the paracorps parachute troops, and they wore a red beret, and we had black boots and they had brown boots, and I don't know, they dressed a little better. And a lot of us in our barracks there, and the camp said, well, he said they were going to go the next day. They were going to the parachute camp, and I can't remember now where it was. We traveled 2 or 3 hours, maybe longer than that, to get to it. But anyway, there was a bunch of us decided that we was going to step out when they called for volunteers to go to the parachute camp, parachute training camp, and try it. And the next morning, they got us all lined up out there on the parade square, and had this open order, open ranks, like in 3 rows. The center row stood still, the front row took 1 step forward, and the rear 1 step back. And then they said all people that wish to go to the parachute training center, take 1 step forward in front of the squad. And I was the only man in the whole camp that ever moved. Everybody else had chickened out or decided they didn't want to. But anyway, I was the only one. And he came and got me and said, we'll go to camp. And we did. And I passed everything, the physical, I passed everything but the eye test. My eyes weren't good enough to be a parachute soldier. But they treated me nice and fed me good, and all that good stuff. Before I forget it, when I got to that camp, first came to that camp, the first thing that I had to do was guard 2 prisoners that were sentenced to life at hard labor. They had killed an officer, and they had to take them, before they took them to the prison, they had to check them to see that they were in good shape, didn't need any more medicine or anything. I had to take them to the eye doctor and the dentist and the other doctor and the foot doctor, and I don't know, I had to take them 6 different places. And at that time, if you let a prisoner escape, you served his sentence until he was captured and brought back to captivity. And if they had never got by, I'd have been life and hard labor. And they gave me, they had them handcuffed together, one hand on each one of them, and they gave me a pick handle, just an ordinary digging pick handle to guard them with. And I said, now I want to tell you boys, before we start, I don't know you, and after today, chances are we'll never see you again. And I'm not going to be disagreeable, but if either one of you or both of you try to escape or try to do anything that you're not supposed to, I'm not going to just hurt you, I'm going to kill you. There's just that much to it. I'm going to take this pick handle and I'll kill you. And they said, well, that's all right, we know where everything is. And said, now will you give us a cigarette? And I said, I'll take 2 cigarettes and lay them down over here on this low wall, and I'll back off and you can walk over there and pick them up. I said, I won't hand them to you, but I'll lay them over there and you can go get them. Well, we got along good. I never had any problem with them all day. I just told them what was going to happen. And, but then after that, the sergeant asked if I would stay at that camp and be a mortar instructor. And I said, well, I don't want to. I want to go with the rest of the boys. Because we knew we were going to go overseas. We knew that the next year was going to be, this was in November, December of 1943, and we knew that sometime in 44 we were going to invade France. And he said he was an old World War I veteran from the 48th Highlanders, and now I can't remember his name at all, but he said, you know that I can request you be kept here, and said, I'll get you sergeant stripes without going to NCO school or anything. You'll be a sergeant mortar instructor. And I said, I still want to go with the rest of the platoon. And he said, well, you know I can keep you here. And I said, I know you can, but I don't think you will. And he said, no, lad, he said, I won't. He said, if you want to go that bad, said, you can go. And I did. And whenever it came time to leave, I come home, I forget how many days I had, close to a week altogether leave, and came home, and I know it was in probably in November sometime. This other part of the dance and so forth was in just before we went to leave that camp, and I came home on leave, and when I went back, was going back, when I left Brown County, I didn't really expect to ever be back. I just didn't think I'd ever make it back. But it didn't bother me any, because I was going to get to see something. What I enlisted in the Army and wanted to go for, I was going to do it, and the fact that I wasn't going to come back maybe, or possibly wouldn't come back, or would come back all ripped to pieces, it didn't bother me. Not to say that I didn't think about it, but it didn't terrify me or anything, because I was going to get to do what I wanted to do. We marched out of the camp and went to a little town called Forest, and it was farming country when you got away from the camp there, and that town of Forest had a big sugar refinery, sugar beets, and there was piles of sugar beets around that refinery that they had big long conveyors that they put them up there. The piles of beets must have been 30 feet high and 200 or 300 yards long, just rows of them there. And we got on the train there, and now before I get any farther there, in 1974, Shorty and I went up to that camp, and I went to the main gate and said that I'd like to go in and look around the camp. Said I was here in 1943 in November, and the guards at the main gate was a young soldier, I mean in his 20s maybe, and an old World War II veteran. And he said, when did you leave this camp in 1943? And I said, well, in November sometime, latter part of November. And he said, how did you go? And I said, we marched right out of this gate and marched up to Forest, which was, I don't know, 3 or 4 miles, 5 miles maybe, I don't know. And he said to the young guard, says, let the man in, said he was here. And he knew that that's the way we left that camp, that we marched out that gate and went to the Forest and caught a train. And but when we got on that train and we were going to Debert, Nova Scotia, and we pretty much went up now it'd be the St. Lawrence Seaway. We pretty much followed the St. Lawrence River. And when we crossed the St. Lawrence, someplace up there, I don't know, it's a big wide river. I think we were on the train 3 nights and 2 days, I believe. But anyway, there was a poker game started, and it just went on the whole trip. And whenever we crossed the St. Lawrence way up eastern Quebec someplace, I looked out the window, and all I could see was just blue sky and water. I couldn't see anything else. And I realized then, I'd been in a poker game, playing poker, and I realized then that we were on a bridge, and we stopped at some town in Quebec. I don't remember the name of it now, but it was real hilly, and there was no automobiles on the street in the town at all. Well, they couldn't have gone any place anyway. It was just hard-packed snow, but it was just horses and sleighs and people in big heavy clothes. And I thought there was some of the cutest girls there that I had ever seen. They had boots with big fur collars on them up on their shins, and fur coats and hats and fur mittens and so forth. But that's just the way they dressed. And there was nothing there but horses. The snowmobiles hadn't been invented yet, and everything was just horses and sleighs. And it was a real pretty town. We marched around and slipped and slid around over town a while for some exercise, and then got back on the train and went on to Debert. and we were there, I don't know, I left the bird. We were there at Christmas time, I do remember that, and when just before we were going to leave there to go overseas, we had a big training exercise. We were out 3 days and 2 nights on that, and slept outside. And I didn't have to walk. I was in the mortar platoon. We rode in weapon carriers. But the first night that we slept out was, the temperature was 28 below zero. And we slept out on a big pile of pine boughs. We broke branches off the pine trees and piled them up. Put a tarp on top of it and put our blankets on top of that to sleep, and then covered up with more blankets. Each one of us had 2 blankets, and we slept in there, and it wasn't all that cold really. We didn't suffer that much. But our carrier driver was absolutely terrified of any authority. A lance corporal didn't bother him too much, but anybody with 2 stripes on up just scared him to death. And we had a big old tall brigadier was the commanding officer of that camp, Brigadier Calhoun. He was a World War I veteran. He's 6 feet 7 inches tall and real slim, and he was a tough old guy. I'll give him credit for that. But he never sat down in his Jeep. He just had an open top Jeep, and he stood up in it just waving around about like the radio antenna did, big tall radio antenna. He'd be out when we'd be in training exercises and so forth. And he wore a big sheepskin coat, big fur collar up and a fur hat, and had big gauntlet gloves that come up almost to his elbows. And he'd call us around every once in a while. And one time he called us up close, and I happened to be where he was, and I was just right up next to his Jeep when he was talking to us. And he says, "Boys, the secret to staying and being able to function in this cold weather is circulation." And he pulled his glove off and pulled his sleeve up and waved his arm around. And he says, "That is the secret, is circulation." And I didn't know until then that circulation smelled just like Scotch whiskey. What circulation smelled like. But getting back to the carrier driver, we were going up this road in Nova Scotia, and the brigadier come up behind us. He started talking, make way in front, brigadier here, make way." And this carrier driver, he just proceeded to wheel right off in the weapons carrier, off in a big deep ditch. Hung up, couldn't go any place, and hit way below zero. And the old brigadier pulled up alongside of us and stopped and looked off down the ditch where we were. And he said, "Tough luck, boys. Damn good practice, so move on, driver." He left us right there. But anyway, that camp, I don't know how far it was from the ocean, but occasionally if the wind was from the east or northeast, there'd be salt spray hit. You could feel it when it hit you in the lips and so forth, you'd lick your lips, it'd be salty. And it was brutally cold, but most of us, the boys from out in Western Canada that it wasn't uncommon out in Alberta and British Columbia, parts of Saskatchewan. We had some from up in the Northwest Territory and Yukon, that the temperature there regularly got down to 40 below, even 50 below. And they suffered with the cold more than the rest of us did, because it was wet cold, and out there it was so dry, and they really suffered from the cold. But we had Christmas dinner there at that camp, and the Canadian Army and British Army, Christmas dinner, the soldiers, other ranks, eat in the mess hall, and the officers wait on them. They carry your food and everything like that, and we had Christmas dinner. And I remember there was a sign, Winston Churchill in one of his speeches about the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain, part of his speech was, "Never in the history of mankind has so much been owed by so many to so few." The whole British population was owed their survival to the Royal Air Force. And this sign in the mess hall said, "Never in the history of mankind have so many waited so long for so little." I never will forget that sign there. But we left that camp and went to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and got on the ship. And the ship that I got on was the Ile de France, was at that time the third biggest ship afloat. It was a French liner, had been a big French tourist liner thing. And I got on a day before anybody else, the troops did. I mean, a whole bunch of us did. They called us advanced guards, and I don't know what we were supposed to be guarding, but anyway, we got on that boat, and we were walking around familiarizing ourselves, they said, with the boat. And I went into recreation room there, and it had books and magazines and all radio and all kind of good stuff like that. And right on top of a table was a bunch of magazines, and the top magazine in that stack was a Saturday Evening Post magazine, and had an article in it with a picture on the front by old Ben Douglas that had the orchard up here on Hickory Hill. And I thought how strange it was that I was 3,000 some miles away from home and walk into a room and there was a story about, and people mentioned in it and so forth, that I knew that was only 3 or 4 miles from home. And I mentioned it one time. They were talking about Hickory Hill, the people down in Waycross, the staff members were talking, found out that I'd lived here all my life, and they were talking about the history of Hickory Hill and the they had seen some labels that had Hickory Hill Orchard, so forth. And they asked me about it, and I told that story about being on the boat in Nova Scotia. And one of the girls that was there was going to school in St. Louis, going to college, and she went to the school library or whatever it was, I don't know, and hunted up that magazine and copied that article and sent it back to me. I've got it here someplace. I'm going to have to quit a while.
Okay, we're, check your chemical control in you. I'm out of battery on mine.
Huh?
I'm out of battery on mine.
What kind of
My battery.
I know one thing.